Vanessa's laughter echoed through the ballroom the second she spotted my dress. $18, she said, her voice dripping with mock surprise. That navy number is a bit thrifty, don't you think? Did you pick that up at a clearance bin? It was mortifying. A few people nearby actually chuckled along with her. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room drifting toward that navy dress. The very dress I'd spent all night hand-stitching and tailoring because it was the only decent thing I could afford to wear. My son, Michael, just stood there beside me, silent. My throat tightened. I gripped my handbag, turned toward the exit, and started walking before anyone could see the tears welling up in my eyes. But then, the room went completely silent. Charles Whitmore, the CEO of Whitmore Capital himself, began walking straight toward me. He didn't stop at Michael. He came right to me, opening his arms to give me a warm, genuine hug, as if we were long-lost family. Before we go any further, I want to ask you a sincere question. Have you ever been judged, for your appearance, your clothes, or the way you live your life, by the very people who should have been lifting you up? If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. I truly love hearing your stories and connecting with you all. I live in a small single-story house on the west side of San Antonio. The paint is peeling around the windows, and the floorboards creak every time someone steps onto the porch. Most people driving by a place like mine wouldn't give it a second glance, but to me that little house holds 40 years of memories. Every morning I still wake up at 5:30, even though I don't have anyone left to pack a lunch for. I make a cup of coffee using the same chipped ceramic mug my husband, Thomas, bought me at a flea market 32 years ago. The words, "World's Best Mom" on the side are almost completely faded now. Sometimes when the house is deathly quiet, I just run my thumb over those letters. As you get older, the silence becomes deafening, especially after losing the person who filled the room with life. 9 years ago, Thomas passed away from heart failure. One moment, he was sitting in his favorite chair watching a baseball game. The next, my entire world collapsed inside the back of an ambulance. After the funeral, people kept telling me the same thing. "You still have Michael." And yes, I did. My son was my pride, my fuel, and the reason Thomas and I had worked ourselves to the bone for all those years. Thomas spent 30 years pouring concrete under the brutal Texas sun. His knees gave out before he turned 60, and the back injury he sustained on a job site never truly healed because we were so desperate for overtime pay that he kept ignoring it. As for me, I did whatever I could find. Cleaning motel rooms, mending uniforms, altering wedding dresses, stitching hems until my fingers bled. I spent years sitting at the kitchen table until 2 a.m., the sewing machine humming away while little Michael slept on the couch just so he could be near me. Sometimes I'd watch him there, his math book resting on his chest, and whisper to myself, he's going to have a better life. During the years when we could barely afford groceries, that dream was what kept me going. There were so many nights when Thomas and I would pretend we'd already eaten dinner so Michael could have an extra portion. We thought he never noticed, but kids always notice. Michael was brilliant from a young age. Teachers loved him. He won scholarships, awards, and opportunities we never could have imagined in our own youth. The day he got into a top-tier MBA program, Thomas cried harder than I'd ever seen him cry before. He held Michael's acceptance letter with shaking hands, just repeating over and over, "Our boy made it." But success doesn't change a person overnight. It does it slowly, one step at a time. At first, Michael called home every night from college. Then it became every weekend, then every few weeks. Eventually, our conversations became rushed and polite, as if he were talking to a distant relative instead of his mother. "I'm busy, Mom. I'll call you later. Work is crazy." Those lines became all too familiar. Then, Vanessa entered his life. The first time I met her, she wore a beige pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. She smiled politely, but her eyes were cold, as if the moment she saw my house, she had already calculated exactly what I was worth. She hugged me carefully, as if my lack of fortune might rub off on her skin. At dinner, she kept asking questions that sounded nice but were anything but. "So, this is where Michael grew up? Did you really make these curtains yourself? This neighborhood must have changed a lot over the years." I knew what she was really saying. How could someone like you raise someone like him? But Michael looked happy, so I swallowed the discomfort. That's what mothers do. We tuck away our own hurt just to keep our children smiling. After they married, things got worse. even if Michael didn't realize it. Vanessa hated me dropping by unannounced. She hated my old-fashioned clothes. She hated my Spanish accent when I spoke too quickly. Once at their Thanksgiving dinner in Dallas, I overheard her whispering to a friend in the kitchen. "Michael's mother is very sweet," she said, "but honestly, she's a bit unrefined." They giggled softly. I pretended I didn't hear it. Because when you love someone deeply, you learn how to survive small humiliations. Even as Michael became more distant, I never stopped being proud of him. Every month I'd grab coffee with my friend Rosa at a local bakery. Every month I'd show her new photos of Michael. Michael in a meeting, Michael shaking hands with executives, Michael standing next to luxury cars. "He works so hard," I'd tell her with a smile. And every time, I meant it. Even though he barely called anymore. Even though birthday wishes turned into simple texts instead of visits. Even though I'd sometimes stare at my silent phone for hours, debating whether I should reach out first. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, while I was finishing a bridesmaid dress for a customer, I heard the mailbox clang. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked to the front door. Tucked in between the bills and grocery coupons was a beige envelope with elegant handwriting. The return address was from New York. My heart tightened. I carried it to the kitchen table to open it carefully. Inside was a short, handwritten note. "Dear Abigail, I hope you're doing well. I still think of your kindness often, more often than you'd imagine. I might finally have the chance to repay a fraction of what I owe you. I hope to see you soon. CW." I stared at the initials for a long time. Then I folded the note and tucked it away in a wooden drawer that held several identical letters. I never told Michael about them. I never told anyone. Some stories feel too sacred to explain, and too important to hand over to careless people. That night, as I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, the Texas sunset painting the room in orange light, my phone rang for the first time in months. It was Michael. A smile instantly broke across my face before I even answered. "Hi, honey." There was a pause on the other end. Then he cleared his throat. "Mom, there's a company gala next weekend. Vanessa and I were thinking, maybe you should come." My heart skipped a beat, so hard it almost hurt. For a moment, I actually thought I was hallucinating. After I hung up that night, I stood in the kitchen alone, pressing the phone to my chest with tears filling my eyes. It had been so long since my son invited me to something important. Not out of obligation, not for a rushed holiday meal, and not because someone else insisted. He wanted me there. At least that's what I told myself. I barely slept that night. The next morning I stared at the meager row of clothes in my closet, mostly old outfits I wore to church or suits from funerals and community events. Nothing looked appropriate for a corporate gala filled with wealthy executives. But I touched each hanger with care. A mother never wants to embarrass her child, especially one she sacrificed everything for. 3 days later, I took the bus to a discount department store near the highway. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed, and teenagers wandered aimlessly through the clearance racks. I spent an hour pretending to browse while secretly double-checking every price tag. Finally, at the back of the store, I found it. A simple navy blue dress with long sleeves, the fabric soft and understated. The tag said $18. I held it up to the mirror. It wasn't flashy, but it looked dignified, and at my age, dignity matters. I bought the dress and took it home, folding it in tissue paper like a treasure. That night, under the warm yellow light of my kitchen, I spread it out on the table. One sleeve needed a tiny repair, the hem was a bit uneven, and there was a loose thread near the zipper. Most people would never notice, but years of sewing experience had made my eyes incredibly sharp. So I picked up my needle and thread and went to work, perfecting every detail. As I worked, memories flooded my mind. I remembered sewing costumes for Michael when we couldn't afford store-bought ones. I remembered fixing holes in his jeans before school. I remembered making Thomas a tie from fabric scraps because we couldn't afford a new one for a wedding. Back then, we had almost nothing, but we still had our dignity and our love. That's worth more than people realize. Around 10 p.m., my phone buzzed. "Michael," I smiled and answered instantly. "Hi, honey." He sounded a bit distracted. "Hey, Mom, just confirming you got the email invite." "I did," I said softly. "Thank you for inviting me." After a short silence, he cleared his throat. "Look, this gala is pretty important. I know there will be investors, senior partners, and a lot of high-profile people there." His tone made my stomach tighten. "I understand, Michael. Vanessa is under a lot of pressure getting everything ready. he rushed to add, so if she seems a little overwhelmed, don't take anything to heart. I looked down at the dress resting on my lap. Oh, I said quietly. Of course. Another pause. Then he said something that stung more than I expected. Maybe just try to keep things simple and low-key, okay? Simple and low-key. I knew exactly what he meant. Don't talk too much. Don't get too comfortable. Don't remind anyone of where I came from. But I swallowed the pain before it could reach my voice. I'll be on my best behavior, I said gently. Michael chuckled a bit awkwardly. I didn't mean it like that, but he did. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. Then I picked up the dress and went back to work. Because mothers are always too quick to forgive those little hurts. The next afternoon, I pulled out my small jewelry box. Inside were the pearl earrings Thomas had given me for our 20th anniversary. They weren't real pearls. We both knew that. But Thomas had saved for months to buy them. You deserve beautiful things too, he'd said while putting them on me. I held them in my palm and smiled sadly. Help me look decent, Tommy, I whispered to the empty room. By Friday, the dress was finished. I hung it on the closet door and stepped back to admire it. It didn't look expensive, but it was clean, elegant, and filled with heart. Somehow that felt important. Saturday morning, Vanessa called unexpectedly. I nearly spilled my coffee reaching for the phone. Hello, Abigail. Her voice sounded unusually sweet. Too sweet. Hello, dear. I just wanted to remind you that the gala starts promptly at 7 p.m. Don't be late. I won't. And one more thing, she added casually. It's a very formal occasion. I understand. We're trying to maintain a certain image. There it was, the real message behind the polite tone. I gripped the phone tighter. I'll do my best, I said calmly. Vanessa chuckled softly. I'm sure you will. The moment the call ended, a strange heaviness pressed against my chest. Not exactly fear, but a warning. Still, I refused to let the negativity ruin this opportunity. Over the weekend, I focused on hopeful thoughts. Maybe Michael really did want me there. Maybe things were finally changing. Maybe this gala would bridge the growing gap between us. Sunday night, my friend Rosa stopped by with bakery treats. When she saw the dress hanging up, her eyes went wide. Oh, Abigail, you're going to look beautiful. I laughed softly. Beautiful isn't exactly the word I would use. It's beautiful. She stepped closer and touched the sleeve. You did this yourself, didn't you? You always find a way to make things look worth more than they are. After she left, her words stuck in my mind, because that was basically my life, creating beauty out of almost nothing. Late that night, I couldn't sleep, so I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and put the dress on for the first time. I adjusted the earrings, smoothed the fabric at my waist, and slowly turned. An older woman looked back at me. My dark hair was streaked with gray, and my tired eyes were framed by lines earned through decades of hard work. But there was something else there, too. Strength. The kind of strength a woman earns in obscurity. I thought of Michael, the little boy who held my hand on his first day of school. I thought of Thomas, smiling proudly at graduations. I thought of all the hard years we had survived together. Suddenly, I realized a painful truth. I wasn't afraid of the wealthy strangers judging me. What I was truly afraid of was that my own son had already started judging me. The next morning, while folding clothes in the living room, my phone buzzed again. An unknown number, I answered cautiously. Hello? A calm, male voice replied immediately. Mrs. Hernandez? Yes, speaking. I'm Jonathan Reed, Mr. Charles Whitmore's executive assistant. My heart stopped. I'm sorry, I whispered. Who? Mr. Whitmore asked me to confirm that you'll be attending the gala next Saturday. I slowly sank onto the sofa. How did he know I was invited? After a brief pause, the assistant answered carefully, Ma'am, Mr. Whitmore has been waiting a long time to see you again. The gala was held at the Grand Meridian Hotel in downtown Dallas. I had never seen such opulence in my life. The building looked like a palace of glass and gold. Huge crystal chandeliers hung outside the entrance, and valets in black uniforms opened doors for guests. The women stepping out wore designer gowns, and the diamonds they wore shone brighter than the city lights. And there I was, gripping my old brown handbag, wearing an $18 dress. For a few seconds I froze near the sidewalk as luxury cars pulled up one after another. I was suddenly and painfully aware of every wrinkle in my dress and every strand of silver in my hair. I almost asked the taxi driver to take me home, but then I remembered the sound of Michael's voice inviting me. Mom, maybe you could come. Maybe it wasn't an enthusiastic invitation, but it was enough to keep me standing there. I took a deep breath, thanked the driver, and walked toward the entrance. The lobby was filled with the scent of expensive perfume and polished marble. Soft piano music floated in the air, and elegantly dressed guests chatted near giant floral arrangements. Everything looked flawless except for me. I spotted Michael almost immediately near the ballroom entrance. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that probably cost more than a month's income. For a brief moment, pride surged through me, washing away my anxiety. That was my boy, my Michael, the kid who once ran barefoot through the sprinklers in our tiny yard. Now he looked like he belonged on the cover of a magazine. When he finally noticed me approaching, his smile seemed a bit delayed. "Mom," he said, giving my cheek a quick peck. "You made it." "You look very handsome," I whispered. "Thanks." His gaze lingered on my dress for a brief second. Not with admiration, but with an evaluation. I noticed his hesitation before he forced another smile. "You look nice." Nice. People use that word when they don't want to say beautiful. Before I could reply, Vanessa appeared beside him in a silver gown that fit like a second skin. Diamonds sparkled on her neck under the ballroom lights. She looked like the kind of woman who had never spent a single day worrying about daily expenses. "Abigail," she said brightly, too brightly, "you're here." I smiled politely. "Of course." Her eyes moved slowly over my dress. I watched her notice the inexpensive fabric, the hand-stitched sleeves, and the worn shoes. Beneath her composed smile, a flash of smugness crossed her face. "Well," she said casually, "I suppose simple elegance never goes out of style." I knew it was an insult, but years of dealing with difficult people had taught me how to pretend nothing was wrong. "Thank you," I replied gently. Vanessa immediately took Michael's arm. "We should introduce her to a few people," she whispered to Michael, though her voice wasn't quiet enough for me not to hear. Michael nodded awkwardly. Just like that, I became a social burden. Vanessa took me through groups of wealthy guests, introducing me each time with that uncomfortable smile. "This is Michael's mother." Not Abigail, not Mrs. Hernandez, just Michael's mother. An accessory, a footnote. Some people shook my hand politely. Others barely looked at me before returning to conversations about investments, vacation homes, and private schools. Once, a woman wearing emerald earrings asked me where I lived. "San Antonio," I answered warmly. "Oh," she said, that one word contained all the judgment in the world. Someone else asked if I was retired. "I still do some sewing work at home," I explained. Their smile instantly went rigid. The moment they heard the word sewing, you could almost see them mentally categorizing me as lower class. It's funny how wealth decides who is worthy of respect. Eventually, Michael walked away to speak with some executives by the bar. Vanessa followed him. Suddenly, I found myself standing alone by a wall of white roses, while hundreds of strangers walked past me as if I were invisible. I took a glass of water from a passing tray, mostly to give my hands something to do. That's when I noticed a few people staring at me. Not with mockery, but with curiosity. An older gentleman near the entrance narrowed his eyes, as if struggling to remember something. Another woman with silver hair glanced at me, then whispered to her husband. At first I thought they were judging my appearance too. But then, something strange happened. A hotel employee approached me carefully. He looked to be about 65, wearing a sharp black service uniform and silver-rimmed glasses. When he stopped in front of me, his entire expression changed. It was recognition? "Mrs. Hernandez?" he asked softly. I blinked in surprise. "Yes." His eyes widened. "Oh my goodness," he whispered. "I knew it was you." I looked at him, confused. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" The man smiled warmly. "No, ma'am, but I've seen your picture before." A chill went down my spine. "My picture?" Before he could answer, another waiter across the hall called his name. He looked back at me regretfully. "I'm so sorry," he said quickly, "but Mr. Whitmore speaks very highly of you." My heart stopped for half a second. Charles Whitmore. Even hearing the name made memories of the past well up inside me. The man smiled respectfully once more and hurried away. After he left, I stood completely frozen, because now I could feel it. Something strange was happening tonight, something far beyond my understanding. "Mom!" I turned around to find Michael coming back, though this time he looked nervous. "Is everything okay?" he whispered. "Yes," I answered slowly, studying his face. You never told me Mr. Whitmore was coming tonight. Michael looked confused. He's the owner of this company. Of course he's coming. I forced a smile. Right, of course. But my chest tightened with nerves. I hadn't seen Charles Whitmore in 35 years. Not since that night when Thomas and I sat in our tiny kitchen watching him admit he had nothing left. He had looked exhausted and hopeless back then. Now he was one of the most powerful businessmen in America. Life can change people in ways that feel unbelievable until you see it for yourself. Mom, Michael suddenly lowered his voice. Try to relax tonight. I am relaxed. You just look a little overwhelmed. Hearing that, I almost laughed out loud. Overwhelmed. I was standing in a world built for people who had been told they were important their entire lives. People like me usually came and went through the service entrance. Still, I nodded politely. I'm fine, honey. Michael smiled distractedly, then glanced at a group of executives behind me who were motioning for him. I have to handle something. Vanessa will keep you company. But Vanessa didn't keep me company. The moment Michael walked away, she leaned in and muttered, Abigail, stop acting so insecure. People can sense your inferiority. Then she walked off without waiting for me to answer. I stood there once again, entirely alone, feeling humiliated, small, and utterly invisible. For the first time all evening, I desperately wished I hadn't come. I reached into my purse and felt the folded handkerchief Thomas used to carry. That simple, small gesture usually calmed me. But before I could fully steady myself, I heard laughter growing louder behind me. It was Vanessa's voice. Somehow, I already knew that sound was about to become my nightmare. Vanessa's laughter drifted across the ballroom like shattered glass. Sharp, cold, impossible to ignore. At first, I tried to pretend it had nothing to do with me. I kept my eyes down, quietly sipping my water while guests moved around under the golden chandeliers. But then, I heard my name. Well, Abigail, Vanessa said loudly, smiling at the small group gathered around her. You never did tell us where you picked up that dress. Several women turned to look at me. I froze. Vanessa tilted her champagne glass carelessly, a playful, cruel light in her eyes. It's vintage, right? She continued. Or maybe custom-made. The women beside her giggled. I understood perfectly what was happening. This wasn't curiosity, it was a performance, and I was the punchline. Michael stood not far away, talking with two executives. I waited for him to notice the tension gathering around us. But he didn't. Or perhaps he chose not to. I forced a polite smile. Oh, nothing special. Vanessa stepped closer. No, tell us, she insisted, her tone dripping with mock sweetness. I'm just dying to know. A voice inside me whispered to stay silent. But I had spent my entire life being honest, even when it was embarrassing. So I gave her the truth. It was from the clearance rack, I said softly. $18. The silence lasted less than a second before Vanessa erupted into laughter. A real laugh, loud enough to make people all over the ballroom turn their heads. $18, she repeated, sounding like she was gasping for air. A few people around her joined in. One man covered his mouth to hide his grin. Another woman looked at my dress with undisguised pity. Vanessa shook her head dramatically. Oh my goodness, she said. Well, that explains everything. More laughter. I felt the heat rushing to my cheeks so fast I thought I might faint. All the insecurity I'd felt walking into this ballroom suddenly tightened around my throat. The cheap fabric, the old shoes, the stitches I'd carefully sewn by hand. In that cruel moment, all my effort had become a joke. Instinctively, I looked toward Michael. Please, just say something, anything. For one brief second, our eyes met across the crowd. I saw a flicker of embarrassment on his face. But it wasn't embarrassment for me. It was embarrassment because of me. He walked over quickly, lowering his voice. Vanessa, he muttered, let it go. But he was smiling awkwardly, as if he just wanted the moment to pass without any discomfort. Vanessa poked his arm theatrically. Sorry, she laughed. I didn't realize our theme tonight was bargain bin fashion. A few guests chuckled again. Michael rubbed the back of his neck, then looked at me. Mom, he said quietly, maybe don't talk about prices like that. That sentence hurt more than all the laughter combined, because I suddenly understood a terrifying truth. My son wasn't ashamed of their behavior. He was ashamed of me. I stared at him in disbelief. This was the same little boy who had gone to school in worn-out sneakers from a thrift store because I couldn't afford anything better. This was the boy who had cried tears of joy when I surprised him with a second-hand bike one Christmas. Back then, we had shared the poverty together. Now he acted as if the poverty belonged to me alone. The noise in the ballroom became a blur. I could barely breathe. Vanessa noticed the pain on my face, gave a small smile, and took another sip of champagne. "I just think that in an environment like this, appearances matter," she said casually to the group, "especially when you're representing someone important." Representing someone important, as if I were a smudge on Michael's polished image. I gripped my purse tightly under the table. Inside was Thomas's old, neatly folded handkerchief. I touched it gently, and suddenly I remembered another night, long ago. After a wealthy customer had insulted the clothes I'd made, Thomas had sat with me at the kitchen table. "Listen to me," he had said, holding my face in his rough, working hands. "There is nothing shameful about honest hard work." I could almost hear his voice right beside me, but the memory only deepened the ache in my heart. A woman near Vanessa leaned in, whispering loud enough for me to hear. She actually admitted the price. Vanessa laughed again. That was the best part. Something inside my chest quietly cracked. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was enough to change some things forever. I looked at Michael one last time. He looked away. In that moment, I realized that in this room I was completely alone. A waiter walked by with a silver tray full of champagne, and this glittering, sparkling ballroom suddenly felt suffocating. Everyone looked beautiful, expensive, and confident, while I felt like a poor old woman pretending to belong in a place I never should have entered. I slowly stood up from my chair. Vanessa noticed immediately. "Oh no," she said, feigning concern. "You aren't upset, are you?" I forced my trembling hands to stay still. "No," I said quietly. "I just feel a bit tired." Michael finally looked me in the eye. "So you're leaving?" His tone sounded more like he was inconvenienced than concerned. I gave a small nod. "It's a long drive back to San Antonio." Vanessa gave a tiny shrug. "Well, thanks for coming." "Thanks for coming." As if I had attended a business meeting instead of an important night in my own son's life. I carefully picked up my handbag, praying the tears wouldn't fall before I reached the parking lot. As I turned toward the exit, snippets of whispers followed me. $18. Did you see her shoes? She's Michael's mother. Every word felt like a knife. Near the entrance, I paused by a marble pillar to steady myself. My chest ached. It wasn't because strangers had mocked me. Strangers can't really hurt you. Family can. I reached into my bag to find my phone, planning to call a taxi. Just then, the screen lit up with a new text, an unknown number. I tapped it slowly. "He is looking for you." My heart skipped a beat. Before I could process it, another popped up. "Mr. Whitmore has just arrived." I stared at the words in confusion. Charles Whitmore. After all these years, why would he be looking for me? Instinctively, I looked back toward the ballroom. The atmosphere had shifted instantly. People were straightening their backs and staff were hurrying across the floor. A ripple of excitement spread through the guests. "The CEO is here." He just arrived. "Charles Whitmore is entering now." Vanessa immediately rushed toward the center of the ballroom, smoothing her silver gown and fixing her smile. Michael adjusted his tuxedo nervously. Everyone suddenly looked desperate to make a good impression. But I remained frozen at the doorway, clutching my trembling phone. Because deep down I already felt that tonight was going to change everything. And for the first time since entering that ballroom, Vanessa Collins was no longer the most dangerous. Or I stood there again, entirely alone, feeling humiliated, small, and utterly invisible. For the first time all evening, I desperately wished I hadn't come. I reached into my purse and felt the folded handkerchief Thomas used to carry. That simple small gesture usually calmed me. But before I could fully steady myself, I heard laughter growing louder behind me. It was Vanessa's voice. Somehow, I already knew that sound was about to become my nightmare. Vanessa's laughter drifted across the ballroom like shattered glass. Sharp, cold, impossible to ignore. At first, I tried to pretend it had nothing to do with me. I kept my eyes down, quietly sipping my water while guests moved around under the golden chandeliers. But then I heard my name. "Well, Abigail," Vanessa said loudly, smiling at the small group gathered around her, "you never did tell us where you picked up that dress." Several women turned to look at me. I froze. Vanessa tilted her champagne glass carelessly, a playful, cruel light in her eyes. "It's vintage, right?" she continued. "Or maybe custom-made." The women beside her giggled. I understood perfectly what was happening. This wasn't curiosity. It was a performance. And I was the punchline. Michael stood not far away, talking with two executives. I waited for him to notice the tension gathering around us. But he didn't, or perhaps he chose not to. I forced a polite smile. "Oh, nothing special." Vanessa stepped closer. "No, tell us," she insisted, her tone dripping with mock sweetness. "I'm just dying to know." A voice inside me whispered to stay silent. But I had spent my entire life being honest, even when it was embarrassing, so I gave her the truth. "It was from the clearance rack," I said softly. $18. The silence lasted less than a second before Vanessa erupted into laughter. A real laugh, loud enough to make people all over the ballroom turn their heads. $18, she repeated, sounding like she was gasping for air. A few people around her joined in. One man covered his mouth to hide his grin. Another woman looked at my dress with undisguised pity. Vanessa shook her head dramatically. "Oh my goodness," she said. "Well, that explains everything." More laughter. I felt the heat rushing to my cheeks so fast I thought I might faint. All the insecurity I'd felt walking into this ballroom suddenly tightened around my throat. The cheap fabric, the old shoes, the stitches I'd carefully sewn by hand. In that cruel moment, all my effort had become a joke. Instinctively, I looked toward Michael. "Please, just say something, anything." For one brief second, our eyes met across the crowd. I saw a flicker of embarrassment on his face. But it wasn't embarrassment for me. It was embarrassment because of me. He walked over quickly, lowering his voice. "Vanessa," he muttered. "Let it go." But he was smiling awkwardly, as if he just wanted the moment to pass without any discomfort. Vanessa poked his arm theatrically. "Sorry," she laughed. "I didn't realize our theme tonight was bargain bin fashion." A few guests chuckled again. Michael rubbed the back of his neck, then looked at me. "Mom," he said quietly, "maybe don't talk about prices like that." That sentence hurt more than all the laughter combined, because I suddenly understood a terrifying truth. My son wasn't ashamed of their behavior. He was ashamed of me. I stared at him in disbelief. This was the same little boy who had gone to school in worn-out sneakers from a thrift store because I couldn't afford anything better. This was the boy who had cried tears of joy when I surprised him with a second-hand bike one Christmas. Back then we had shared the poverty together. Now he acted as if the poverty belonged to me alone. The noise in the ballroom became a blur. I could barely breathe. Vanessa noticed the pain on my face, gave a small smile, and took another sip of champagne. "I just think that in an environment like this, appearances matter," she said casually to the group, "especially when you're representing someone important." Representing someone important. As if I were a smudge on Michael's polished image. I gripped my purse tightly under the table. Inside was Thomas's old, neatly folded handkerchief. I touched it gently, and suddenly I remembered another night, long ago. After a wealthy customer had insulted the clothes I'd made, Thomas had sat with me at the kitchen table. "Listen to me," he had said, holding my face in his rough working hands. "There is nothing shameful about honest hard work." I could almost hear his voice right beside me, but the memory only deepened the ache in my heart. A woman near Vanessa leaned in, whispering loud enough for me to hear. She actually admitted the price. Vanessa laughed again. That was the best part. Something inside my chest quietly cracked. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was enough to change some things forever. I looked at Michael one last time. He looked away. In that moment, I realized that in this room I was completely alone. A waiter walked by with a silver tray full of champagne, and this glittering, sparkling ballroom suddenly felt suffocating. Everyone looked beautiful, expensive, and confident, while I felt like a poor, old woman pretending to belong in a place I never should have entered. I slowly stood up from my chair. Vanessa noticed immediately. "Oh no," she said, feigning concern. "You aren't upset, are you?" I forced my trembling hands to stay still. "No," I said quietly. "I just feel a bit tired." Michael finally looked me in the eye. "So you're leaving?" His tone sounded more like he was inconvenienced than concerned. I gave a small nod. "It's a long drive back to San Antonio." Vanessa gave a tiny shrug. "Well, thanks for coming." "Thanks for coming." As if I had attended a business meeting instead of an important night in my own son's life. I carefully picked up my handbag, praying the tears wouldn't fall before I reached the parking lot. As I turned toward the exit, snippets of whispers followed me. $18. "Did you see her shoes? She's Michael's mother. Every word felt like a knife. Near the entrance, I paused by a marble pillar to steady myself. My chest ached. It wasn't because strangers had mocked me. Strangers can't really hurt you. Family can. I reached into my bag to find my phone, planning to call a taxi. Just then, the screen lit up with a new text, an unknown number. I tapped it slowly. "He is looking for you." My heart skipped a beat. Before I could process it, another popped up. "Mr. Whitmore has just arrived." I stared at the words in confusion. Charles Whitmore. After all these years, why would he be looking for me? Instinctively, I looked back toward the ballroom. The atmosphere had shifted instantly. People were straightening their backs, and staff were hurrying across the floor. A ripple of excitement spread through the guests. "The CEO is here. He just arrived. Charles Whitmore is entering now." Vanessa immediately rushed toward the center of the ballroom, smoothing her silver gown and fixing her smile. Michael adjusted his tuxedo nervously. Everyone suddenly looked desperate to make a good impression. But I remained frozen at the doorway, clutching my trembling phone. Because deep down, I already felt that tonight was going to change everything. And for the first time since entering that ballroom, Vanessa Collins was no longer the most dangerous or intimidating person in the room. The moment Charles Whitmore arrived, the atmosphere in the ballroom changed completely. It happened almost instantly. Conversations died down into nervous whispers. Executives straightened their suit jackets. Women adjusted their jewelry and posture, as if it weren't just a businessman walking into the room but royalty. Even the waiters moved differently, faster, sharper, more alert. Near the entrance, I remained frozen by that marble pillar, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. My pulse hammered against my ribs, almost painfully. "Mr. Whitmore has just arrived." Even now, the message felt unreal. I hadn't seen Charles in 35 years. 35 years. A whole lifetime. Before Charles entered the ballroom, I had considered leaving. Part of me wanted to slip away into the night before the old memories flooded back. But there was another part, the younger me, buried under decades of struggle and grief, who wanted to know if he remembered me at all. On the other side of the room, Vanessa's demeanor had shifted entirely. The cruel playfulness was gone, replaced by a refined elegance. She stood near the center of the ballroom, one hand resting lightly on Michael's arm, smiling at every executive who walked by. I watched her smooth her silver gown for the third time in less than a minute. She wanted to impress Charles Whitmore. Everyone did. Michael spotted me still standing near the exit and walked over quickly. "Mom," he whispered, "where are you going?" I was getting ready to head home, but now... I looked at him closely. For a fleeting second, I tried to search his face for guilt, regret, or shame for what had just happened. Yet, he looked only anxious. Not for me, for his image. "You should stay," he whispered. "The CEO is about to speak." I almost laughed at the irony. Just minutes ago, when people were mocking me for an $18 dress, he had stood by without a word. Now suddenly, he wanted me to stick around. "I don't think I belong here," I said quietly. Michael sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Mom, please don't do this." "Don't do what?" "Don't make tonight any more embarrassing than it already is." Those words hit me like cold water. Embarrassing? I stared at my son in disbelief. "Do I embarrass you that much?" I asked softly. His expression shifted immediately. "I didn't say that." "But that's exactly what you mean." Michael looked away first. That said it all. For a few painful moments, neither of us spoke. The ballroom lights shimmered off his tuxedo, and memories flooded my mind so suddenly they almost buckled my knees. Michael at 7, crying because another boy had made fun of his worn-out backpack. Michael at 13, apologizing after I caught him coloring over the holes in his sneakers with a black marker. Michael at 17, promising me he would never forget where he came from. And now, here we were. My son was dressed in luxury, and I stood before him, feeling smaller than I had in years. "I never cared about money," I said low. Michael exhaled impatiently. "This isn't about money." "No," I said sadly, "this is about shame." His jaw tightened. "You're overreacting." That sentence hurt more than Vanessa's laughter. Because cruelty from strangers is one thing, but being emotionally abandoned by your own flesh and blood is a completely different kind of pain. Before I could reply, Vanessa appeared beside us. "You're here," she said, beaming at Michael. "Charles should be walking in any second." Then her gaze turned to me. "Oh, you're still here." "Still here," as if my very existence were an inconvenience. Michael lowered his voice instantly. "My mom was just leaving." Something flickered across Vanessa's face. relief. "Oh," she said softly. "Well, if you're tired—" For the first time all evening, I looked her straight in the eye. Vanessa was beautiful. Perfect makeup, perfect posture, the perfect confidence of the wealthy. But underneath all of that, I suddenly noticed something else. Fear. Not fear of me, but fear of losing her status. People like Vanessa build their identity on social validation. They survive on the admiration of others like flowers survive on sunlight. And tonight, for the first time in her life, something threatened her carefully controlled image. "I think I should go," I repeated calmly. Michael nodded, too quickly. "That's probably for the best." Those 4 words hit my chest like a final betrayal. "That's probably for the best." I forced a weak smile to keep the tears from falling. Then I adjusted the strap of my purse and turned again to walk toward the exit. Just then, a faint static hum came over the ballroom speakers. A voice echoed through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said warmly, "please welcome the chairman and CEO of Whitmore Capital, Mr. Charles Whitmore." Thunderous applause broke out instantly. Everyone turned toward the grand staircase near the ballroom entrance, myself included. Suddenly, he appeared. Older, gray-haired, distinguished, but without a doubt it was Charles. He walked down the stairs slowly, surrounded by a swarm of cameras. Executives rushed forward eagerly, all hoping for a handshake or a brief word. But Charles didn't seem to notice them at all. His eyes were scanning the room, searching for someone. At first I told myself it was just my imagination. Then his gaze landed straight on me. My breath hitched. Everything around me seemed to vanish. The music, the applause, the conversation. In that frozen moment, it felt like 35 years of time had instantly melted away. Charles Whitmore watched me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. Shock, emotion, relief. Then, something happened that no one in the ballroom expected, myself included. Charles didn't go to greet the board members waiting by the stage. He changed direction entirely. He moved through the crowd with quick, determined strides, and the crowd automatically parted to make a path for him. He was coming toward me. Whispers immediately began to spread. "Where is he going? Who is that woman? Does he know her?" As Charles drew closer, Vanessa straightened up immediately, her smile suddenly becoming even brighter. For an awkward second, I think she honestly believed he was coming toward her. She even lifted her chin slightly, adjusting her stance. But Charles didn't look at Vanessa, nor Michael, nor anyone else. His eyes remained locked on mine the entire time. My hands began to tremble because I suddenly recalled with perfect clarity the last time I had seen him. A young, desperate man sitting in my kitchen with tears in his eyes, admitting he had nothing left. And now, he stood before me as one of the wealthiest men in America. When he finally stopped only inches away, the ballroom went dead silent. I saw Michael's face filled with confusion. Vanessa looked stunned. Charles watched me with emotion for a few seconds, then spoke softly. "Abigail." To hear him call my name after so many years nearly broke me. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. Then, before anyone could react, Charles Whitmore stepped forward and pulled me into a tight embrace. Like family, like a man filled with gratitude, like a man hugging the benefactor he had been searching for too long. Gasps erupted throughout the ballroom. Champagne glasses froze in midair. All the color drained from Vanessa's face. And against my shoulder, I heard Charles whisper the words that changed everything. "I have never forgotten everything you did for me." For several seconds, no one in the ballroom moved. Charles Whitmore kept holding me, while hundreds of wealthy guests stared at us in stunned silence. I could even hear the faint clink of a glass somewhere in the back of the room. It was that quiet. When Charles finally stepped back, his hands remained lightly on my shoulders, as if needing to confirm I was real. His eyes were full of emotion, almost uncontrollable, and I suddenly saw the shadow of that young man in this refined billionaire standing before me. "Abigail," he said softly again, shaking his head in disbelief. "All these years." I struggled to find my voice. "You remember me." Charles let out a light, emotional laugh. "Remember you?" he repeated. "There hasn't been a year in my life where I have forgotten you." Whispers rippled through the ballroom. People looked both confused and curious, desperately trying to figure out why one of the most powerful CEOs in the country was speaking to an old woman in an $18 dress with a tone that said, "She is more important than anyone else in this room." I instinctively glanced at Michael. His face had gone completely pale. Vanessa looked frozen in shock. Just minutes ago, she had been mocking me in front of everyone. Now the CEO himself was standing beside me like I was a VIP. Charles turned slowly to the crowd, his arm still protectively around me. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said firmly, "I would like to introduce you all to the woman who changed my life." The silence deepened. Vanessa blinked rapidly. Michael looked like he couldn't breathe. An executive in the front row chuckled nervously, clearly thinking Charles was joking. But Charles didn't smile, not even a little. Instead, he looked straight at me with unmasked respect. "If it weren't for Abigail Hernandez," he continued, "Whitmore Capital would not exist today." Shocked whispers broke out across the ballroom. I immediately lowered my eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "No, Charles," I whispered. "You built your company yourself." He shook his head firmly. "I was only able to build it because you gave me a chance to survive." Michael suddenly stepped forward. "Sir," he said cautiously, "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake." Charles turned to him slowly. The atmosphere shifted instantly. "A mistake?" Charles repeated calmly. Michael swallowed hard. "I mean, my mother never mentioned she knew you." Charles stared at him for a long time, then asked me quietly, "She never told you?" "No, sir." A look of pain flickered across Charles's face. Then he turned to me with a look of disbelief. "You really kept the secret for all these years?" I smiled sadly. "I told you, Michael needed to succeed on his own." Vanessa looked completely lost now. Her gaze darted between us, desperately trying to understand the conversation unfolding in front of everyone. Charles finally spoke to the room again. 35 years ago, he began slowly, I was bankrupt, completely bankrupt." The ballroom fell silent once more. "I received calls from debt collectors every day, banks turned down every meeting, investors threw me out of their offices." He paused. "For a while I was even sleeping in my car because I couldn't afford rent. No one moved, no one dared breathe loudly, because people rarely hear billionaires talk about failure." Charles looked down at me gently. "Then I met Abigail and her husband Thomas. Hearing Thomas's name made my chest tighten instantly. They owned a small tailor shop in San Antonio," Charles continued. "Nothing fancy, just hardworking, honest, ordinary people struggling to survive." Memories flooded my mind. That little shop with the faded curtains, Thomas humming a tune while mending a jacket, the air filled with the scent of coffee and fabric late at night. Back then, we had almost nothing ourselves. But Thomas always believed that kindness was more important than comfort. Charles smiled faintly, lost in the memory too. "During the worst week of my life, I walked into their shop. My suit was torn and I didn't have the money to fix it." He chuckled softly. "Honestly, I probably looked like a drifter back then." A few guests chuckled awkwardly, but no one interrupted. "In those days, most people avoided me," Charles said calmly. "I looked like a failure." His gaze found mine again. But Abigail sat me down, brought me coffee, and listened. The ballroom remained quiet. "She listened to me for nearly 2 hours," Charles continued, "about my business plan, about the company I dreamed of building, about all the doors that had been slammed in my face." I remembered that conversation clearly now. The young Charles, eyes weary, hands shaking as he held his coffee cup. Desperate men always carried a specific kind of sadness, and Thomas and I recognized that sadness immediately because we had lived it ourselves. "I still remember what Thomas said that night," Charles continued, my throat tightening. Charles smiled tenderly. He looked at Abigail and said, "Sometimes good people just need someone to believe in them." My eyes welled up instantly. That sounded exactly like something Thomas would say. He always believed in others before anyone else did. Charles let out a slow breath and added, "The next morning, Abigail called me back into the shop." I closed my eyes briefly. I remembered that morning too. Thomas and I had barely slept, debating if we were crazy. Because the money we planned to give Charles represented almost every cent of the savings we had worked for years. Money for emergencies, money for Michael's future. Money that stood between our family and disaster. But there was something genuine about Charles, and Thomas trusted my intuition completely. Charles scanned the ballroom carefully. Abigail and Thomas handed me an envelope containing almost all their savings. Gasps rippled through the room. Michael stared in disbelief. Vanessa looked terrified. I stared quietly at the floor because hearing the story out loud made the sacrifice feel heavy all over again. "I tried to refuse," Charles said softly. "I told them it was too much, that I might fail." His voice grew slightly choked. But Abigail said something I will never forget. He turned fully toward me. "You said to me, if you succeed, promise me you will stay kind." My tears finally slipped down. I remembered saying those words. At the time, success had seemed so out of reach for all of us. Charles swallowed and continued. That money kept my company afloat long enough for an investor to finally agree to back me. He paused. That one investor changed everything. The ballroom remained frozen in silence. Then Charles added softly, I have spent years trying to repay them. I shook my head gently. You already have. No, he said firmly. Not nearly enough. Michael suddenly stood unsteadily beside Vanessa. You gave him your savings, he whispered to me. I looked at my son carefully. Yes, all of it. Most of it. Michael stared at me as if he didn't recognize his own mother anymore. Maybe he didn't. Because children rarely understand how much their parents sacrificed until, as adults, they are forced to face it honestly. Vanessa finally found her voice. But if that's true, she stammered, why is Abigail still living so modestly? Charles turned to her slowly. The tension in the room spiked again. Then, with a voice as calm and sharp as a blade, he replied, because unlike most people in this room, Abigail Hernandez has never measured a person's worth by their money. Vanessa's face turned bright red. Several guests nearby immediately shifted their gaze away from her in embarrassment. For the first time all evening, she was completely speechless. After Charles said those words, the ballroom was unnaturally quiet. Because suddenly everyone in the room was looking at me differently, not with pity, not with mockery, but with something far more uncomfortable for people like Vanessa. Respect. I wished they wouldn't. Being the center of attention always made me uneasy. Thomas used to joke that I could spend all day mending wedding dresses for strangers, but if someone complimented my own shirt, I would panic. So, as hundreds of eyes stared at me under the brilliant chandeliers, I just wanted to disappear, to return to the life I understood. But Charles wasn't finished. He gently guided me toward a chair at the front of the ballroom. Sit with me, he said tenderly. I'm fine standing. You have been standing for long enough in life. The tenderness in his voice nearly broke my heart. I sat down beside him slowly, while the guests around us continued to whisper. Michael and Vanessa stood nearby, both looking emotionally shattered, though in very different ways. Michael looked confused, while Vanessa looked terrified. Charles took a glass of water from a waiter and turned to the crowd again. There is one more thing all of you should understand, he said calmly. I immediately shook my head. Charles, but he just smiled at me gently. Don't hide anymore. Those words weighed heavily on my chest. Because for years, hiding had become second nature. Hiding the struggle, hiding the sacrifice, hiding the pain, especially from Michael. Charles clasped his hands together thoughtfully and continued. When Abigail and Thomas helped me, they weren't wealthy people making an easy investment. He paused. They were gambling with everything they had. Several guests looked down, perhaps imagining if they could make such a sacrifice if the roles were reversed. Most knew they never could. I looked down at my hands quietly, the memory so vivid that the ballroom around us almost disappeared. Back then, our tailor shop was tucked away on a narrow street on the edge of San Antonio. Every time it rained hard, the roof would leak. Half our customers were always behind on their bills because they were struggling too. Some months, Thomas and I barely earned enough to cover utilities. Still, we survived, barely. I remembered the night Charles first walked into our shop. It was pouring rain, and water was even seeping under the front door. I was finishing a hem on a bridesmaid dress, and Thomas was checking receipts at the counter. Then, the door opened. A young man walked in, wearing a soaking wet gray suit with torn sleeves, his face etched with exhaustion. I'm sorry, he whispered. I know you're probably closing. Thomas looked up and smiled instantly. No problem. Come on in. That was Thomas. Always kindness first. Charles explained that he needed the jacket mended before an important investor meeting the next morning. I can pay later, he admitted awkwardly. I remember seeing the shame burning behind his eyes, the pride stung by desperation. Thomas glanced at me briefly, then he just said, We'll fix it. No judgment, no doubt, only kindness. While Thomas mended the jacket, Charles sat at my sewing table drinking coffee from our mismatched mugs. Somehow he began to talk about everything. The business he dreamed of building, technology no one believed in, banks that rejected him, mountains of debt, and the fear of failure that crushed him every day. I know how crazy this sounds, he finally said with a frustrated laugh. Honestly, I think people look at me and see someone chasing an impossible dream. I remembered responding calmly, sometimes impossible dreams just need more time. Recalling this, a faint smile appeared on Charles's face. She believed in me before there was anything worth believing in, he told the ballroom. I looked down in embarrassment again, but the truth was more complicated. It wasn't belief in success. It was empathy. Thomas and I recognized the struggle because we were living it too. Later that night, after Charles left the shop, Thomas and I sat together at the small kitchen table while the rain tapped against the window. He was telling the truth, I whispered. Thomas nodded slowly. I know. He is desperate, I know. We sat in silence for a while, and I finally looked at him and asked, if we help him? Thomas looked at me carefully. No anger, no shock, just thoughtful. How much help are we talking about? I swallowed hard. Everything. Even now, 35 years later, I still remember the silence after that word. Because everything meant our savings account. Every cent we had spent years saving. Money for emergencies, money for Michael's future, money that stood between our family and disaster. Finally, Thomas leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply. Do you trust him? I trust him. Imitating person in the room. Thomas looked down at his rough hands for a long time. Then he gave a sad smile. Well, he said softly, your heart has always been better than mine. I immediately laughed through my tears. No, just more reckless. He reached across the table and took my hand. No, Abigail, he whispered, a brave heart. Back in the ballroom, I blinked away the tears as Charles continued. The next morning, he said, they handed me an envelope containing almost every dollar they had saved. Several guests were clearly moved now, especially the older ones. Because those with age understand sacrifice differently, we know the cost of placing your security, your future, and your hopes into someone else's hands. I asked them why, Charles continued calmly. Why would you take such a massive risk for a stranger? He looked straight at me again. And then Abigail said something that changed my life. I closed my eyes briefly because I already knew what he was going to say. She said, money comes and goes, but if kindness disappears, the world becomes unbearable. The room fell silent again. Hearing my words from so many years ago repeated back to me felt exposing, because at the time, they hadn't sounded wise or noble. They had just sounded true. Charles smiled faintly. Those words stayed with me through every success I had afterward. Michael slowly sat down nearby, his face still pale. His eyes were fixed on me, as if he were seeing his own mother for the first time. I don't understand, he whispered. Why you never told me any of this? I turned to him slowly, because this was a question that had waited decades for an answer. You were just a boy then, I said gently. But this is a huge deal, Mom. No, I replied softly. You were the huge deal. Michael frowned slightly. I continued carefully. Your father and I never wanted you to grow up thinking success could be handed out through connections or favors. My voice trembled slightly. We wanted you to become strong on your own. Michael stared at me speechless. Charles nodded quietly beside me. She made me swear never to interfere in your future unless it was absolutely necessary. Vanessa suddenly looked confused. What do you mean, interfere? Charles's expression shifted. Then he replied calmly, Michael's MBA scholarship. Michael blinked. What about the scholarship? Charles held his gaze steadily. It exists because your mother asked me to establish it. The entire ballroom gasped again. Michael looked physically shaken. No, he whispered. That's impossible. That scholarship was merit-based. It was, Charles replied. You earned it on your own. But after your father passed, when tuition became unaffordable, Abigail came to my office privately. My chest tightened painfully with the memory. I had hated that meeting, hated needing help, especially after spending my whole life trying to be self-reliant. But Thomas had only been gone 3 months, and hospital bills had swallowed almost everything we had left. Meanwhile, Michael's acceptance letter sat on our kitchen table like a dream, and a threat. I remembered him saying, maybe I should wait a year, Mom, because he knew we couldn't afford it anymore. That night, after Michael fell asleep on the couch from exhaustion, I sat alone in the dark, staring at Thomas's photo for nearly 2 hours. Then, the next morning, I called Charles. Not for charity, never charity. I only asked for a chance. I didn't want him to carry the burden of our struggles, I said softly. Now Michael looked devastated. You sold the truck Dad left behind, he said slowly, as if piecing together fragments of a memory. You told me it was because you didn't need it anymore. I lowered my eyes. That money paid for your first semester's housing deposit. His face twisted slightly. And the life insurance? Most of it went to the hospital debts. Michael covered his mouth with a trembling hand. The ballroom around us remained dead silent. No one wanted to interrupt anymore because this story was no longer entertainment. Now it was personal, human, and painful. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly desperate for the attention to move elsewhere. But Charles wasn't finished. "There is one more thing everyone here has the right to know," he said firmly. I immediately looked up. "Charles, please." He smiled at me tenderly. "Stop protecting people from the truth." Vanessa froze at these words. Charles turned to the crowd again. "When Abigail first invested in my company, I offered her formal shares." Whispers spread instantly. Investors nearby exchanged shocked looks. "But she refused to profit from my desperation," Charles continued. "So I set up something called a legacy agreement." Michael frowned. "What's that?" Charles looked straight at him. "It means your mother still holds the honorary founding shares of Whitmore Capital." The room erupted into shocked murmurs. Vanessa's champagne glass nearly slipped from her hand. Michael stared blankly, but Charles remained composed. "She has held them for 35 years. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling overwhelmed again. Those shares never truly mattered to me personally. I barely even thought about them anymore. But Charles had insisted years ago. "If this company survives," he told me, "a part of it will always belong to the Hernandez family." Back then, I thought he was just emotional and grateful. None of us imagined Whitmore Capital would turn into a billion-dollar empire. Michael looked completely stunned. "Mom," he whispered, "why didn't you ever tell me?" I met his gaze carefully. "Because I didn't want you to grow up with a sense of entitlement." His face tightened with emotion. "I'm your son." "Yes," I said softly, "which is exactly why I wanted you to build your own life." Vanessa suddenly found her voice. "Well, honorary shares don't necessarily equal financial ownership," she said quickly, forcing a nervous smile. The desperation in her tone was obvious. She needed this revelation to seem small so she wouldn't look quite as humiliated. Charles turned to her slowly. "It includes annual dividends," he said calmly. Vanessa went completely pale. Several executives nearby now even looked embarrassed for her, because everyone in the room understood what she had done earlier. She had mocked an old woman for an $18 dress, never realizing that the woman quietly owned a part of the company her husband worked for. But the truth behind it went even deeper. I felt humiliated, not because I was poor, but because people took it for granted that simplicity meant being worthless. Charles stepped a bit closer to me. "For years, Abigail has donated almost every dividend," he continued. Now even I looked surprised. "Charles, you know it's true." He turned to the audience. "She anonymously funded employee hardship programs, education grants, emergency aid for widows." He paused. "And she never wanted any recognition." Michael looked at me as if his heart were being torn out in real time. "You donated it?" he whispered. I gave a small shrug. "Some people needed it more than I did." Vanessa blinked rapidly. "But if you had so much money," she stammered, "why did you live like that?" The question hung heavily in the room. Charles looked disappointed by it, but honestly I wasn't angry. Because people like Vanessa truly believed that wealth existed to show superiority. Having resources and not displaying them didn't make sense to her at all. I answered before Charles could. "Because money only changes who you are if you worship it," I said softly. The ballroom fell quiet again. I continued gently. "Thomas and I were surrounded by hardworking people our whole lives. Some were wealthy, some weren't, but the kindest people we ever met were usually those who understood struggle." Vanessa lowered her head immediately. For the first time all night, she seemed unable to maintain that perfect confidence. Meanwhile, Michael looked emotionally destroyed. Tears filled his eyes as memories surfaced, one by one. Every birthday, every tuition payment, every sacrifice. He hadn't questioned them because I had never allowed him to see the cost. "You worked extra jobs after Dad died?" he whispered suddenly. I nodded slightly. "You told me that was because you liked keeping busy." "I needed the money to pay the insurance premiums." He closed his eyes briefly. "And those nights you sounded so tired on the phone." I smiled sadly. "I usually finished my sewing work around 2 a.m. Michael immediately turned his head, unable to hide his tears anymore. That moment hurt almost as much as the humiliation earlier, because no mother wants to see her child overwhelmed by guilt, even if it was earned. Charles finally placed a hand gently on Michael's shoulder. "Your mother did everything she could to protect your future," he said calmly, "and everything she did was out of love." Michael nodded shakily. Then he turned to me slowly, and for the first time all evening, he truly looked ashamed. Not ashamed for me, but for himself. The ballroom around us remained in a painful silence. People weren't pretending not to watch anymore because this was no longer a show. It was a collapse. The collapse of carefully constructed images, Vanessa's perfect social mask, Michael's illusion of his own success, and even my own lifetime of habitual silence maintained to keep the peace. Everything had shattered completely under those brilliant crystal chandeliers. Vanessa looked around nervously, clearly realizing she no longer controlled the room. "You're painting me like some kind of cold-blooded villain," she whispered. Michael looked at her in disbelief. "You did that to yourself?" That sentence seemed to hit her harder than anything Charles had said all night, because deep down, Vanessa had probably believed that Michael would always choose her version of reality over anyone else's, including mine, especially mine. But tonight, for the first time, my son finally saw the full picture, and the truth, while painful, does change things. I quietly picked up my handbag from the chair beside me. The movement immediately caught Charles's attention. "Are you leaving?" he asked gently. I nodded. "I think it's time." Michael turned to me instantly. "Mom, wait." "No, honey." I smiled softly, though my chest still ached. I've had enough attention for one night. To be honest, I felt incredibly tired. Not physically, but emotionally. The grievances I had swallowed for years had finally surged to the surface all at once, and my heart didn't quite know how to settle. Charles was by my side immediately. "At least let my driver take you home. You've done more than enough." "No, Charles, please." His expression softened. "You don't even know." I touched his arm lightly. "Thomas would be so proud of the man you've become today." Emotion flashed across Charles's face. For a second, he looked like that struggling young businessman again. Not a billionaire, just a man mourning someone who had believed in him. "He believed in me when I didn't deserve to be believed in," Charles said quietly. "He believed in everyone." Charles smiled sadly. "Yes, that is a rare thing." Around us, the guests began to stand and clap slowly. It started light, then grew louder. The sound caught me completely off guard. I looked around in confusion to see dozens of people rising from their seats, one after another. They were giving me a standing ovation. My throat tightened instantly. Just an hour ago, some of these same people had been chuckling when Vanessa mocked my $18 dress. Now they were standing and applauding as if they had respected me all along. It's almost funny how quickly public opinion shifts when wealth and power change directions. But strangely, I wasn't angry anymore, just sad. Because kindness should never be dependent on status. I lowered my head and looked at my dress one last time under the ballroom lights. The carefully stitched sleeves, the uneven fabric, the cheap shoes. Earlier tonight, wearing it had made me feel humiliated. Now, suddenly, none of it made me feel embarrassed. Because dignity isn't something expensive people grant you. It's a strength you carry deep within yourself. With Michael beside me, I walked slowly toward the ballroom exit. Halfway there, he whispered, trembling, "I don't deserve your forgiveness yet." I looked at him carefully. "No," I said softly, "you don't." The truth clearly hit him, but before the shame could break him entirely, I continued, "But that doesn't mean you can't earn it." For the first time all evening, a faint, fragile spark of hope flickered in my son's eyes. Michael's brow furrowed slightly as I spoke. I continued, careful with my words. "Your father and I never wanted you to grow up thinking that success is something handed to you by connections or favors. We wanted you to become someone strong, someone who built their own path." My voice wavered just a bit. "We wanted you to earn your own way." Michael stared at me, speechless. Beside me, Charles gave a quiet nod. "She made me promise never to interfere with your future unless it was absolutely necessary." Vanessa looked suddenly confused. "What do you mean, interfere?" Charles's expression shifted and he replied calmly, "Michael's MBA scholarship." Michael blinked. "What about the scholarship?" Charles held his gaze firmly. "It only exists because your mother asked me to create it." A collective intake of breath swept through the ballroom. Michael looked physically shaken. "No," he whispered. "That's impossible. That scholarship was merit-based." "It was," Charles answered. "You earned it yourself, but after your father passed, when the tuition became impossible to cover, Abigail came to my office in private." My chest tightened with the memory. I had hated that meeting. I hated needing help, especially after spending my whole life striving for self-reliance. But Thomas had only been gone for 3 months, and the hospital bills had swallowed almost everything we had left. Meanwhile, Michael's acceptance letter sat on our kitchen table, a dream that felt more like a threat. I still remembered him saying, "Maybe I should wait a year to go, Mom," because he knew we couldn't afford it. That night, after Michael fell asleep on the couch from exhaustion, I sat alone in the dark for nearly 2 hours, staring at a photo of Thomas. The next morning, I called Charles. Not for charity, never for charity. I only asked for a chance. I didn't want him to carry the weight of our struggles, I said softly. Now Michael looked devastated. "You sold the truck Dad left behind," he said slowly, as if piecing together a fractured memory. "You told me it was because you didn't need it anymore." I looked down. "That money paid the deposit for your first semester of housing?" His face twisted slightly. "And the life insurance?" "Most of it went toward the hospital debt." Michael covered his mouth with a trembling hand. The ballroom around us remained dead silent. No one wanted to interrupt anymore because this story wasn't for entertainment anymore. It was personal, human, and raw. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly desperate for the attention to move elsewhere. But Charles wasn't finished. "There is one more thing that everyone here has a right to know," he stated firmly. I looked up immediately. "Charles, please." He gave me a gentle smile. "Stop protecting people from the weight of the truth." Vanessa froze when she heard that. Charles turned back to the crowd. "When Abigail first invested in my company, I offered her formal equity." Whispers rippled through the room again. Nearby investors exchanged shocked glances. "But she refused to profit from my struggle," Charles continued. "So I created what I called a legacy agreement." Michael frowned. "What is that?" Charles looked him in the eye. "It means your mother still holds the honorary founding shares of Whitmore Capital." The room erupted in stunned murmurs. Vanessa's champagne glass nearly slipped from her hand. Michael stared blankly, but Charles remained calm. "She has held them for 35 years. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling overwhelmed. Those shares never really mattered to me personally. I rarely even thought about them anymore. But years ago, Charles had insisted. "If this company survives," he had told me, "a part of it will always belong to the Hernandez family." Back then, I thought he was just being emotional and grateful. None of us imagined that Whitmore Capital would turn into a billion-dollar empire. Michael looked completely stunned. "Mom," he whispered, "why didn't you ever tell me?" I met his gaze carefully. "Because I didn't want you to grow up with a sense of entitlement." His face tightened instantly with emotion. "I am your son." "Yes," I said quietly, "and that is exactly why I wanted you to build your own life." Vanessa suddenly found her voice again. "Well, honorary shares don't necessarily equate to financial ownership," she said quickly, forcing a nervous smile. The desperation in her tone was obvious. She needed this revelation to seem insignificant so she wouldn't feel so embarrassed. Charles turned slowly toward her. "They include annual dividends," he said calmly. Vanessa's face went completely white. Several executives nearby even looked embarrassed for her, because everyone in the room now understood what she had done earlier. She had mocked an older woman for an $18 dress, never realizing that this woman quietly owned a portion of the company her husband worked for. But the truth behind it went even deeper. I felt humiliated, not because I was poor, but because people assumed that a simple life meant having no value at all. Charles stepped a bit closer to me again. "For all these years, Abigail has donated almost every single dividend," he continued. Even I looked a bit surprised. "Charles, you know it's true." He turned to the audience. "She anonymously funded the Employee Assistance Program, educational grants, emergency aid for widows." He paused. "And she never wanted any recognition for it." Michael looked at me as if his heart were being torn open in real time. "You donated it?" he whispered. I gave a small shrug. Some people needed it more than I did. Vanessa blinked rapidly. "But if you had that much money," she stammered, "why would you still live like that?" The question hung heavy in the room. Charles looked disappointed by it, but honestly I wasn't angry, because people like Vanessa truly believe that wealth is meant to show superiority. Having resources and not displaying them made absolutely no sense to her. I answered before Charles could. "Because money only changes who you are if you worship it," I said softly. The ballroom went quiet again. I continued gently. "Thomas and I were surrounded by hard-working people our whole lives. Some were wealthy, some were not, but the kindest people we ever met were usually those who understood the struggle." Vanessa looked down immediately. For the first time all night, she seemed unable to maintain that veneer of perfect confidence. Meanwhile, Michael looked emotionally dismantled. As the memories surfaced, one by one, tears filled his eyes. All the birthdays, all the tuition payments, all the sacrifices. He had never questioned them because I never allowed him to see the cost. "Did you take extra work after Dad passed?" he whispered suddenly. I nodded slightly. "You told me that was because you liked keeping yourself busy." "I needed the money to pay the insurance premiums." He closed his eyes for a second. "And those nights when you sounded so tired on the phone?" I gave a sad smile. "I was usually finishing up sewing work around 2 a.m. Michael turned his head away instantly, unable to hide his tears any longer. That moment pained me just as much as the humiliation earlier, because no mother ever wants to see her child overwhelmed by guilt, even if it is warranted. Charles finally placed a hand gently on Michael's shoulder. "Your mother did everything she could to protect your future," he said quietly. "Everything she did was out of love." Michael nodded, trembling. Then he turned slowly to me. For the first time all night, he truly looked ashamed. Not ashamed of me, ashamed of himself. After the truth came out, the ballroom didn't feel glamorous anymore. The crystal chandelier still glowed overhead, and champagne still flowed through the crowd. The string quartet near the stage still played soft music. But beneath all the elegance, something real and deeply uncomfortable hung over the room. Reality. And reality is never as flawless as wealth tries to paint it. Michael stood only a few feet from me, motionless, his face pale and weary. The confident executive everyone admired had vanished completely. Now he looked like a lost little boy again. I hadn't seen him with that expression since the day Thomas died. "Mom," he said softly, his voice cracking on the word. My chest tightened. No matter how much our children hurt us, hearing them break still stings a mother's heart. I stood up slowly from my chair, smoothing the wrinkles in my inexpensive navy dress out of habit. Michael looked down at the fabric, the very dress he had silently allowed others to mock. It was clear that this hit him again, reminding him of everything that had just happened. "I didn't know," he whispered. I gave a faint, sad smile. "I know." "No, you don't understand." He shook his head quickly. "I really didn't know anything." Charles stood nearby, wisely staying silent. This wasn't his moment anymore. It belonged to a mother and son standing among the ruins of their own fractured history. Neither of them could quite grasp it all. Michael swallowed hard and continued, "All those times you said you were fine." His eyes welled up again. "You weren't fine at all." I looked at him gently. Parents usually don't tell their children how afraid they are. That sentence seemed to break something inside him. He covered his mouth briefly, trying to keep his composure. A few guests nearby looked away respectfully, pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. Because hardship brings humility, and tonight my son was finally learning what humility was. "I thought—" Michael struggled to catch his breath. "I thought Dad's life insurance covered everything. It covered enough to keep us going, but you took on so many extra shifts." I nodded gently. "And the bills." His gaze fell on my hands. A pair of aged hands, hands shaped by decades of sewing, scrubbing, carrying, and surviving. Hands he hadn't really looked at in years. I watched him notice the tiny scars near my fingers for the first time in a long time. They were little white marks from sewing needles over the decades. Thomas used to tease me and kiss those scars, calling them badges of love. Michael stared at them in silence. Then, suddenly, he asked painfully, "How many times did you go hungry?" The ballroom became so quiet I could hear someone set down a glass nearby. I hadn't expected him to ask that, not because it wasn't true, but because I thought Michael had never noticed. I tried to laugh it off. "Oh, honey." "Please," he whispered, "don't lie to me anymore." My throat tightened, so I answered honestly. "Sometimes at the end of the month," I admitted softly, "but it wasn't a big deal." Michael closed his eyes instantly, as if the words physically wounded him. Perhaps they did, because when children realize their parents were hiding hunger, their memories of that hunger change into something else entirely. I remember one winter especially clearly. Michael was 16. His school was hosting an expensive academic competition trip in Austin, and he wanted to go so badly. By wealthy standards, the cost wasn't high, but for us, it was an impossible number. That month, Thomas and I quietly lived on canned soup and toast for nearly 2 weeks just to put that money together. Michael never knew, at least I thought he didn't. "I used to hear you in the kitchen late at night," Michael said suddenly. I looked at him closely. You heard me? You thought I was asleep. His voice began to tremble. I heard you crying sometimes. My eyes misted over. Because a mother always thinks she hid her pain much better than she actually did. I'm sorry, I said quietly. His face twisted in disbelief. Sorry? He repeated. Mom, why are you apologizing to me? Because mothers apologize for everything. For the struggle, for the sadness, for not being able to protect their children from the hardships of life, even when they've sacrificed everything they have. Michael wiped his eyes roughly and then looked around the ballroom in shame. Then his gaze landed on Vanessa. She stood a few feet away, completely isolated by the crowd. People who had been laughing with her moments ago were now avoiding eye contact. It's ridiculous how quickly cruelty can turn into embarrassment once the power shifts. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. I didn't know about these things either, she said defensively. No one responded, not even Michael. She took a shaky breath. How could I have known? Charles finally spoke up again, his voice calm and cold. You didn't need to know she had money, he said. What you should have done was show her respect regardless. The words landed like another sharp slap across the room. Vanessa's face turned bright red. I never intended. Yes, you did, Michael interrupted calmly. Everyone looked at him. His voice wasn't loud, which somehow made it worse. I heard you laugh, he continued, and I let it happen. His gaze moved back to me. That was my fault. For the first time all night, I saw genuine shame in my son. Not performative guilt, not embarrassment from being exposed in public. Real shame, the kind that can change people if they're willing to accept it. Charles stepped closer to him. You have talent, Michael, he said calmly. You work hard. Your career is something you earned yourself. Michael nodded weakly. But character is more important than talent. The room remained silent. Charles continued, I have seen people accumulate wealth, yet end up spiritually bankrupt. If you forget the people who brought you to where you are, success is meaningless. Michael hung his head completely. I know. No, Charles corrected gently. Tonight you finally understand. Those words weighed heavily on everyone's heart, especially mine. Because deep down, I also realized something painful. I had spent so many years protecting Michael so thoroughly from struggle that he perhaps forgot what struggle looked like. Not intentionally, but gradually. Success had surrounded him with refined people, expensive places, and carefully curated appearances. Somewhere along the way, he began to act like Vanessa, viewing simplicity as a failure. The difference was, Vanessa was born and raised in that environment. Michael had simply forgotten that there was a better way to be. I let you down, he whispered suddenly. I shook my head immediately. No, I did. Tears were flowing freely down his cheeks now. You stood there while they mocked you, and I cared more about appearances than protecting my own mother. Hearing him finally say it out loud stung a part of my heart. Because that was the true wound, not Vanessa's cruelty but Michael's silence. I walked closer carefully. You hurt my heart tonight, I admitted quietly. He flinched instantly. But you are still my son. His expression completely crumbled. Then, I am truly sorry, Mom. The words sounded broken and real. In that dangerous moment, I almost forgave everything immediately. That is the weakness of being a mother. We give our love before the wounds have even healed. But before I could answer, Charles cleared his throat calmly. There is one more thing, he said. The ballroom tightened again. Charles was looking straight at Michael now. The board had planned to announce your promotion tonight. Michael blinked in confusion. What? You are being considered for a promotion to regional partner. Vanessa looked up sharply, but Charles's expression was unreadable. Being considered, he repeated cautiously. An icy silence spread through the ballroom. Michael stared at him slowly. Suddenly, everyone understood the implication of those words. After Charles finished, the silence was unbearable. You were being considered for a promotion to regional partner. No one moved in the ballroom. No one even pretended to drink their champagne, because everyone understood exactly what had happened. Michael's future, the promotion he had likely worked years for, suddenly hung in the balance. And Vanessa realized it too. The last of the color drained from her face. What does that mean? She asked urgently, her voice too sharp. Being considered? Charles looked at her calmly. It means that before a final decision is made, the board and I will need more time. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. You're going to delay his promotion over this? Charles's expression turned slightly harder. No, he said calmly. I am delaying it because leadership is tested in moments exactly like this one. The tension in the room became suffocating. Michael hung his head immediately, but Vanessa wasn't finished. That is ridiculous. The words spilled out before she could stop herself. Michael is one of the best executives in this firm. A few people nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Charles maintained perfect composure. I agree, he replied. He is smart, ambitious, and capable. Then this shouldn't be an issue. Oh, Charles said softly. This is very much an issue. His voice never raised, which somehow made him even more intimidating. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. So now personal feelings are beginning to influence business decisions? The second those words left her lips, I saw Michael close his eyes in frustration, because Vanessa still didn't understand the real issue. This was never about my feelings. It was about character. Charles stepped slightly closer to her. Mrs. Collins, he said calmly, do you know why I established an employee assistance program here at the firm? Vanessa hesitated. No, because I remember what it felt like to be treated as if you had no value when you were struggling to survive. The room was silent again. Charles continued, I built this company because I believe that success should make a person kinder. His gaze sharpened slightly. Not crueler. Vanessa looked away. For the first time tonight, her confidence seemed to have truly cracked, but what followed was something ugly rising beneath the fractures. Anger. Not regret, but anger. She looked at me suddenly. This whole thing is just absurd, she muttered. She could have said something a long time ago. That hit me harder than I expected. Because even now, even after everything, Vanessa still believed that money was the issue. As if my fault was in not announcing my value loud enough. Charles looked disappointed. Michael looked shocked. But Vanessa couldn't control herself, continuing, You let everyone think you were poor? I answered softly, I am not wealthy, Vanessa. Oh, please, she mocked. You own a part of this company. I hold honorary shares and I rarely touch them. That's still more than most people here. I shook my head gently. You still don't understand. Vanessa gave a bitter laugh. No, I understand perfectly now. You did this on purpose to embarrass us. That sentence finally triggered a response from Michael. Enough, he said sharply. Vanessa turned to him in disbelief. What? You need to stop talking. Her eyes widened instantly. Michael had never used that tone with her before, not once, but the control he had carefully maintained for years was falling apart around him tonight. Vanessa stared at him, stunned. You're actually defending this? She asked, her voice low. Michael looked at her as if he didn't recognize her anymore. My mother was humiliated in front of everyone in this room. Vanessa immediately mocked. She was fine. That sentence changed Michael's expression. Not a dramatic shift, but a quiet one, like the last thread suddenly snapping. She was not fine, he said quietly. I saw it. In that very moment, my son finally truly saw me again. Not as a background detail, not as an obligation, not as a simple woman from San Antonio who embarrassed his polished life, but as a living person, a mother, a woman who raised him through hardship that he had never fully paid attention to. Vanessa looked nervously around, suddenly realizing the crowd around her was no longer sympathizing with her. People were now watching her closely, judging her in the same way she had judged me earlier. It's ridiculous how fast the wind shifts in a room when power changes hands. To regain control, Vanessa forced a fragile smile and turned to a few guests nearby. I think tonight is just a bit too emotional for everyone, she said dismissively. No one laughed. No one came to her rescue. The silence that followed was incredibly cruel. Then, across the ballroom, a young server with a tray of champagne glasses accidentally bumped into Vanessa. A little champagne splashed onto the side of her silver gown. It wasn't much, just a few drops. But Vanessa exploded instantly. Watch where you're going, she screamed. The young server, who had just turned 20, went pale. I am so sorry, ma'am. Do you know how expensive this dress is? The entire ballroom went still again. The server looked terrified, and suddenly I saw a deep familiarity in that young girl's eyes. Shame. The kind of shame that wealthy people inadvertently manufacture with a passing comment. Vanessa continued angrily. This is what happens when a hotel hires careless people. Charles's expression turned dark instantly. The young server was still trembling in apology. Sorry, ma'am, I didn't mean to. Oh, you clearly didn't mean to, Vanessa interrupted coldly. But that doesn't change the fact that you're incompetent. Michael looked horrified. Vanessa, he muttered. But she kept going. Because when people think those of lower status make a mistake, they expose their true character most clearly. And tonight, Vanessa Collins was completely unmasked. Charles walked slowly toward the trembling server. Then, he personally and gently took the tray from her shaking hands. "It's all right," he said gently. "Go take a break." The young girl looked like she was about to cry. "Thank you, sir." She hurried away. Then, Charles turned to Vanessa. For the first time all night, he showed unmasked disappointment. "My mother cleaned hotel rooms for 15 years, he said calmly. Vanessa froze. She worked herself to the bone in 2 jobs, while people wearing expensive clothes talked to her exactly the way you just talked to that young girl. No one in the ballroom dared to move. Charles continued calmly. "One of the fastest ways to know the true nature of a person is to watch how they treat those who are of no use to them." Vanessa's face turned red to the roots of her hair. Michael looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Honestly, I almost felt sorry for him, because discovering that your partner lacks kindness is a heartbreak in itself. Charles handed his champagne glass to another server and spoke again. "Effective immediately," he said calmly. "Mrs. Collins will no longer participate in the Whitmore Foundation Charity Board." Gasps rippled through the room. Vanessa blinked rapidly. "What?" "The foundation represents vulnerable families, struggling workers, and scholarship recipients." Charles's voice remained steady. "You are clearly not suited to carry that responsibility." "You have to be joking. I am very serious." Vanessa looked desperately at Michael now. "Say something." Michael stared at her in silence for several seconds. Then, the moment that truly changed everything arrived. Because for the first time in his life, my son didn't rush forward to protect his wife's image. Instead, he looked at her, his eyes filled with weariness and silent disappointment. "How many times," he asked quietly, "did you tell me that sending money to my mom was just fueling her dependency?" Vanessa went pale instantly. My heart skipped a beat, because suddenly I understood something too. Michael looked away painfully. "I thought those were my own thoughts." The room became deathly silent, and Vanessa's expression gave away the truth before she even opened her mouth. Before her lips could move, her silence had answered the question. Michael stared at her, the look of realization spreading across his face like a crack in glass. "All those times," he murmured, almost to himself. "Every time I wanted to help my mom more." Vanessa crossed her arms defensively. "I was just trying to protect our future." Michael let out a hollow laugh. "Our future." His voice sounded tired now, not angry, just weary. "You told me my mother needed to learn to be independent." "She did." That sentence finally made something in Michael's eyes harden. I recognized that look, because it was the same expression Thomas had every time he saw someone cross a line he could no longer forgive. "After my dad died, she raised me on her own," Michael said quietly. "She worked herself to the bone just to save my future." Vanessa opened her mouth to argue, but Michael continued before she could speak. "And tonight, you mocked her over a dress." The ballroom remained in painful silence. People weren't pretending not to look anymore because this wasn't a play. It was a collapse. The collapse of a carefully constructed image. Vanessa's perfect social mask. Michael's delusion of his own success. Even my own lifetime of keeping silent just to keep the peace. Everything shattered under the light of that brilliant crystal chandelier. Vanessa looked nervously around, clearly realizing she no longer controlled the room. "You make me sound like a monster," she whispered. Michael looked at her in disbelief. "That's what you did yourself." That sentence seemed to strike her harder than anything Charles had said all night. Because deep down, Vanessa probably believed that Michael would always choose her version of reality over anyone else's, including mine, especially mine. But tonight, for the first time, my son finally saw the full picture. And the truth sometimes really does change you in a painful way. I reached for my handbag on the chair next to me. The movement immediately caught Charles's attention. "Are you leaving?" he asked gently. I nodded. "I think it's time." Michael turned to me immediately. "Mom, wait." "No, honey." I gave a soft smile even though my chest still ached. I've had quite enough attention for one night. Honestly, I suddenly felt incredibly tired. Not physically, but emotionally. The slights I had swallowed for years finally surged to the surface all at once, and my heart didn't know where to put them. Charles stood beside me immediately. "At least let my driver take you home. You've done more than enough." "Charles, no." His expression softened. "You don't even know." I touched his arm gently. Thomas would be so proud of the man you've become today. Emotion flashed across Charles's face immediately. For a second, he looked like the struggling young businessman from years ago. Not a billionaire, just a man missing the one person who had believed in him. When I wasn't worth believing in, he believed in me, Charles said softly. He believed in everyone. Charles gave a sad, wistful smile. Yes, that is a rare thing indeed. Around us, the guests began to clap. It started soft, then grew louder and more rhythmic. The sound caught me completely off guard. I looked around in confusion, seeing dozens of people one by one rising from their seats. Standing for me, my throat tightened instantly. Just an hour ago, some of these same people had been laughing along when Vanessa mocked my $18 dress. Now they were applauding as if they had respected me all along. It is truly ironic how quickly public opinion shifts when wealth and status change hands. But strangely, I wasn't angry anymore. I just felt a deep, quiet sadness. Because kindness should never depend on someone's position in life. I looked down, catching one last glimpse of my dress under the ballroom lights. The hand-stitched sleeves, the uneven fabric, the inexpensive shoes. Earlier tonight, wearing it had felt humiliating. Now suddenly none of it mattered. Because dignity isn't something that the wealthy or powerful grant to you. It is a strength you carry within your own heart. With Michael walking beside me, I started toward the ballroom exit. Halfway there, he whispered, his voice trembling. I don't deserve your forgiveness yet. I looked at him carefully. No, I said softly. You don't. The truth clearly hit him hard. But before the weight of his shame could pull him under completely, I added, but that doesn't mean you can't go out and earn it. For the first time all night, a faint, fragile spark of hope flickered in my son's eyes.